这是王德发的财经笔记，这里能帮你快速找到资讯内容价值点。在本期大摩的讨论中，我总结了3个关键点，这些对于捕捉投资机会非常有帮助。1. 投资者应意识到，当前的贸易战形势比2018年更为严峻。这次的关税战不仅涉及中美两国，还包括了加拿大和欧洲等美国的盟友。这种情况可能会影响全球大型企业的扩张计划和投资信心，因此在未来的投资决策中需要考虑到更多复杂因素。2. 其次，中国的两会可能不会推出更多的经济刺激措施，因此投资者可能需要调整对市场的预期，考虑到政策可能带来的影响。3. 最后 AI 科技领域的快速发展可能会开启新的投资机会，未来我们可能会看到更多的 AI 科技公司选择在香港上市，这其中隐藏着2个我认为非常有潜力的投资机会。在视频的最后部分，我还总结了这些趋势所涉及的具体投资机会。面对当前的投资环境，我们需要清晰地规划未来的投资策略和节奏。对于那些不习惯观看英文原版视频的观众，可以直接跳到视频的末尾，那里有对重点内容的总结。另外，未来海外的银行账号以及港美股账号越来越严格了，有需求的抓紧开。来我首页的电报群可以协助你全部搞定。
This week, let's bring in Robin Sheng, Chief China Economist at Morgan Stanley. Good morning, Robin. Nice to see you.
Morning.
So there's the NPC, there's the tariff story. Obviously, there's an overlap between the two. I want to ask you, let's start with the tariff story. So we're at 20% right now. The likelihood that this goes up is what for you? Because I would imagine that becomes increasingly disruptive to markets specifically.
First of all, the tariff in this round is much faster and broader than the one we had in 2018 to 19. In 2018, it took about 7 months to see a 10% increase of U.S. tariffs on China. Now it took only 7 weeks. We had 20% tariff on China. And more, there is broader tariff on a lot of countries, Canada, Mexico, even other U.S. allies like Europe. This type of tariff threat is much broader than 2018 to 19. So I think the bottom line is the impact on global corporate confidence could be even worse than 2018 to 19, given the tariff is faster and broader. However, if you ask impact to China, we built in 25% cumulative tariff increase in our forecast for Chinese growth back in November last year after Trump won the election. Right now, the tariff increase 20% is more or less like front-loading our base case into first quarter of this year, but it's still within that 25% range we have provided in our modeling. So that's basically answering your question. For a lot of investors, the tariff risk on China is more or less in their model. However, what has not been in the model, what has surprised people is the broader tariff on other countries. That's going to create a downside risk to global corporate confidence and FDI.
We spoke with Tsinghua Zidao Kui yesterday, and he's quite sanguine about the tariff risk. He said that Chinese economy is fully prepared for tariffs, which of course could be up to 60%. And I know you wrote last week about your expectation is a net increase in augmented fiscal deficit expected to rise 1.4%. So I want to ask, does 1.4% offset a 60% tariff? And if we want to offset a 60% tariff, what do we need if not?
I don't think the 1.4% increase in augmented deficit will be enough to resolve China's deflation problem. But it's a complex issue. I enjoyed so much from watching your China show because there are 3 things you covered so well in the last month or so. Tech, tariff, and all these economic policy targets in China. So tech, tariff, targets. You mentioned the fiscal deficit and the GDP targets from China. But meanwhile, what has changed is on the tech side. There were so many tech breakthrough news over the last 2 months with the rise of DeepSeek, little dragons from China on robotics, humanoids. I think that's a game changer for investors' sentiment. That reminds global investors there is innovation capabilities here, and that also bring a revival of animal spirit. At least in the tech sector, we met with so many entrepreneurs. They feel excited after seeing now with much lower cost of AI, the AI adoption could be accelerated in China. And the Chinese tech firms are so good at adoption side, as you know. So I think there is a revival of animal spirit, and the meeting between, I see it as China's Stargate moment. They will probably encourage all these startup firms to go to Hong Kong for IPO, use that capital market ecosystem to grow. So I do think there is a revival of animal spirit, even without economic stimulus. However, China is still in these broader economic structural problems, housing downfall, deflation, and again, that 1.4% increase in augmented deficit, which, by the way, could be still investment-centric. The consumer portion of this package to be announced tomorrow will likely to be modest. So that's still not enough to resolve all these broader economic problems like deflation. But what has changed is the revival of animal spirit in the tech sector. So I do see some green shoots, despite current policy setup is still not enough to reflate.
Should we look to tomorrow for the offset, though? I mean, one of the comments coming through is either bullets are being saved for a worse day in the future, or policymakers are simply looking to see how the economy responds, and then they will deploy. And I'm wondering whether we've ratcheted up our expectations for tomorrow so much unnecessarily.
I think you are right. The expectation on the MPC, on the government work report, has been more or less like much more reasonable than in previous years. I think what has changed is, number one, there has been a policy pivot since September. So China did something, tried to provide a floor. So this March MPC is seen as a continuation of that commitment. It's not something surprisingly new. Number two is on the tech side, all these breakthroughs helped to stabilize confidence. So people's focus gradually shifted from just on how much stimulus, how much handouts, to what can I do with the cheaper cost of AI? My firm can adopt this and try to do some business. So I do think the expectation in the market has been much more pragmatic and reasonable than in previous years. Having said that, since September pivot, we kept saying the current setup of the policy is still not sufficient. I don't think it's more about saving the bullets for potential tariff escalation. It's more due to Beijing's mindset of, they have a high debt problem. They don't want to do too much stimulus due to the concerns on debt. Meanwhile, they are still in the camp of if we do stimulus, we probably need to focus more on the supply side, investment, rather than consumer or social benefits. Last but not least, these moral hazard concerns. Will the central government step in to provide direct funding to restructure some of the local debt and the housing debt problem? We don't know yet. I think they are still debating internally. That debate has not been settled due to the moral hazard concern. That's the three problems constraining their policy reaction.
That's a really good point on that idea of some amount of policy inertia, or that things are still being worked out, and the point about the mindset in Beijing. You've written that you're expecting a limited effort when it comes to seeing economic rebalancing. And I want to ask, because the rhetoric has actually been quite strong on that from Xi and other policymakers. So what is actually preventing that economic rebalancing? And what are the consequences if we don't see that coming through the MPC, if we don't see that coming through other forums this year?
I would say they tried. At least from October last year, they started to provide more cash for clunkers, this subsidy program for consumer goods. And this year, in the MPC, they are probably going to expand that program to cover not just the home appliance, but phones, some fast retailing goods. However, it's still goods. That showed it's an interesting mindset. If you are trying to encourage consumption on something, you try to focus on goods with a supply chain, goods like electronics or EV cars, because the supply chain can benefit. But we are arguing they can expand that effort to the scope of covering entertainment, services, travel, watching a movie, because all of these are creating the ecosystem for innovation eventually. People demand better image quality from movies, from games, that may help their GPU industry. So that's the ecosystem. But at this moment, at least in the upcoming MPC, I would say the focus of consumer trade-in program is still on these consumer goods, durable or some electronics, rather than overall entertainment or services. So that's one thing. The other one is over the longer run, a more sustainable pathway for boosting consumption is social welfare reform to provide benefits to that 250 million migrant workers, so they will reduce their precautionary saving once they had benefits like public housing, healthcare, and education. But that's very costly. We estimated the central government need to do fiscal transfer of up to $1 trillion in about 2 years, because migrant workers and farmers, they don't have their employers pay that pension contribution in last decade. So central government need to step in, providing that money to fill in the gap. And I think internally they are still debating, because that's a major shift of China's fiscal policy from an investment-centric fiscal policy, construction, capex, to social services. That debate has not been settled yet. Yeah.
Okay. Just a very brief one, Robin. What does that tell us about decision-making process?
I would call this reactive nature of policy is due to multiple factors. I mentioned the concerns on debt, these moral hazard concerns, plus this investment-centric approach. However, eventually they will be evaluating the social dynamics. So if there is enough evidence from job market, from social incidents, from all these things they monitor with all these unemployment rate, I do think that feedback will trigger stronger, more decisive policy reaction. Like we witnessed back in September last year, it was partially triggered by the concerns on the local government functioning and how the market has been struggling lately.
Yeah. Robin, fantastic, as always. And we look forward, of course, to hearing from you again and the team there and more of these updates coming through. And
我们来总结一下：一、知识更新与行业认知迭代，关税动态。美国的关税策略已经从对华孤立转向多边施压，这导致全球供应链的避险需求显著上升。当前形势比2018年更为复杂，关税战不仅影响中美关系，还波及到加拿大和欧洲等美国盟友。目前要评估这场关税战对各方的具体影响还为时尚早。另外，在投资中要避开过于依赖海外市场的公司。二、中国的两会与投资者预期，今年的中国两会可能不会出台更多刺激措施，投资者需要适当降低预期。摩根士丹利的这一结论有其道理，但背后的原因不仅仅是担心道德风险等问题，更重要的是当前全球关系紧张，利率高企，简单的经济刺激难以解决实际问题。中国面临的核心问题是资产收益率偏低。三、香港市场的 IPO 机会，香港市场可能会迎来一批 AI 科技公司的 IPO， 这一趋势已出现端倪。目前，许多 A 股上市公司已经开始申请在 H 股2次上市，这里有2个值得关注的投资机会：一是直接参与港股的 IPO， 二是关注港交所这家公司。作为市场基础设施的提供者，港交所在这一过程中也可能受益。